Uh, Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Um, my name is Eugen Hriscu. I am a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. I have specialized in working with drug and alcohol addictions. And I am very happy to be here to have a discussion about two books concerning my field, but with a different angle, with Norman Ohler. He is the author of a book that has been translated in Romania under the name Nazis and Drugs. It's about the influence of drug use on leaders and also German infantrymen during the World War II. And more recently, a book that has not been is not yet translated in Romanian, about the current, what they call the psychedelic renaissance, and also the history of psychedelic use in the United States and more recently in the world. So, welcome to Romania.
Thank you very much.
I know that you have been publishing both fiction and non-fiction, not related to drug use. I would maybe start by asking you what prompted this interest in the history of drug taking in Europe.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers of the festival for having me here in Romania. It's actually my first time. And I've been fantasizing a lot about coming to Romania, and it never worked out. So I'm very happy actually to see Bucharest. And I walked through the city this morning and visited actually the palace of the parliament.
Okay.
And I'm happy to be here another 2 days to see more. And I would also be interested in learning from you about the drug scene, or especially about the psychedelic scene, but we can come to that maybe a bit later on. Well, I am basically a novelist. Everything I write is invented, or I always thought that, I want to invent things. I was trained as a journalist, and I thought these formats are too small, and there's always someone in the office telling you what to write. So I broke free from that very early on, and I said I just want to write novels and just want to invent my own worlds. And after publishing 3 novels, I didn't know what the next project could be about. And I have a good friend in Berlin. He's a DJ, and I asked him. His name is Alex. I said, Alex, what should I write about now? And Alex said, you should write about Nazis and drugs. And I said, yeah, but that's a stupid idea, because Nazis didn't take any drugs. Because I was raised in the 80s in Germany, in West Germany, and we were taught quite a lot about National Socialism. That was still like at the core of the education, is to understand National Socialism, the atrocities of the Third Reich, the Second World War. And not only in school, but also like for me, I spoke to my grandfather about this, and he was quite open to talk about it. But there was never any mention of drugs. When Alex, my DJ friend, said you should write about Nazis and drugs, I said this is sounds like a great topic, but there's nothing to it. And he said, well, there is something to it, because yesterday I received a package called Pervitin. From a friend. He had a friend who was an antique dealer, and he bought everything from an old apartment in East Berlin in 2010, like all the furniture. Like this antique dealer just took the whole old apartment, and he found an old medicine chest in that apartment, and the medicine chest had like a little closet, and this closet contained actually medicine from the 40s in Germany, and one of the packages was called Pervitin, And my DJ friend Alex got interested in this specific package because on the side of the package it said contain, like the ingredient in Pervitin is methamphetamine. And being a DJ in 2010, he was very interested in methamphetamine because it's a very known street drug that we also call crystal meth. So he was like, methamphetamine comes from the 40s in Germany. He actually took
the pills that he found.
yeah, and they were still active, like, which is kind of crazy, but they were like high German quality products. So these pills from the 40s influenced a DJ in 2010. He said, he told me, this was in my writing room in Berlin, he said, yeah, I took one pill of methamphetamine and I could already feel like something's happening inside of me. I had like more energy. So I just took another one and it became stronger, the effect. And then I took a third one and then I had really like a very strong drug experience. And he told me this and I thought, this is insane, you know. Was like methamphetamine a popular drug in Nazi Germany? Like this was the first, you know, time I heard about this. And I did a little bit of research online and there was not much to be found, but there was one historian, he was a Medizinhistoriker, medicine historian, Dr. Peter Steinkamp, a young researcher from from a southern German university. And he had written one essay, just like a few pages, where he said, and this was, you know, published like in university, like it wasn't a known text, but the conclusion of his text was you know, very interesting to me because he said without methamphetamine, he said there would be no blitzkrieg, the type of war that the Nazis were very successful in conquering first Poland and then the Western countries, France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. This blitz campaigns would not have happened without methamphetamine. So this was a very interesting thesis. I contacted the historian and he told me exactly where in the military archive of Germany, which is an incredibly big building in Freiburg in the south of Germany, I could find the proof of how the German army used methamphetamine to promote its, you know, its campaigns, and that was the starting point. So I started researching not only in Freiburg in the military archive. I later went to many archives actually, and I found stuff everywhere where I specifically looked for drug abuse or drug use during the so-called Third Reich. And then I said to Alex, yeah, you're right. My fourth novel should be about Nazis and drugs because there's quite a big story to tell. I also had found by then the records that Hitler's personal physician, Theo Morell, had kept about what he gave to Hitler, which was also very interesting. So I started to write a novel, and then I showed it to my German publisher, Kiepenheuer und Witsch, Kiwi, and my publisher said, yeah, this is all extremely interesting, but I think the novel is not a good format for this because the topic is, in his opinion, so relevant that it should be a non-fiction book. Like he said, the reader would really like to know what actually did happen, while in a novel, obviously, I mean, there are novels which are very well researched, like Jonathan Littell's novel about the memoirs of Die Wohlgesinnten of an SS officer. Like you can write a very well-researched novel, which makes the novel very effective, but he said in this case it would actually be more effective if we would read a non-fiction book. So as a reader, we would know like this is actually what really happened, like nothing invented in the book. And my reaction was, I don't want to write a non-fiction book because non-fiction books are boring. I had this idea of like German academic historical non-fiction books, which are actually, there's a lot of very boring books which are highly relevant, but they're just horrible to read. And I said this to my publisher, I said, I can't write a boring book. And he said, well, maybe you find a way to write it in a non-boring fashion. And this kind of then became a literary challenge for me. And this was actually, then it became interesting to try to write a nonfiction book. I never thought about writing nonfiction books before, but I immediately thought that his conclusion that it should be a nonfiction book is correct, and that's how this book came about.
So I think it's quite an achievement to publish a book in 2015, I think it was.
Yeah.
And have people in the field calling it a very relevant and even a game changer in the field of Nazi history, World War II. So I think you managed to say something relevant about a subject that has been studied in so much detail after all this time. I think that's quite impressive. How did you take that kind of feedback?
Well, I was kind of lucky, I guess, because my German publisher contacted Penguin in England and offered them the English rights for this book before it came out, before it had come out in Germany. And Penguin, they read it and they liked what they read, but they weren't sure if it's like relevant or not. So they gave it to Ian Kershaw, who is the leading, like he's the Hitler's biographer, basically. Wrote a great biography on Hitler. And Ian Kershaw read this. I only found this out later and reported back to Penguin. This is a relevant work. It's very interesting. I missed this because he did miss it. And then later on, I looked at. Well, no, actually, while I was writing it, I looked at Kershaw's obviously biography, and like he says, he also noticed that Morell gave Hitler lots of drugs, but he like just has like one sentence which says something like, and also Hitler had this somewhat dubious personal physician who prescribed him over 150 different medicines and drugs, which had some kind of influence. But that's where he stops. He doesn't go into the he like doesn't open the window that I opened.
Yeah.
But he did acknowledge that there was this window that I kind of looked through, and so I was very. I mean, for the book, it was lucky that Ian Kershaw read it in such an early phase and gave this blurb to Penguin, and then they bought the English rights, and then the book became an international book, which before it was a German book. But and maybe in Germany it would just have disappeared. It's also possible, that it comes out and no one really reads it or reviews it, and then it, it's still there, but no, you sell like maybe 2,000 copies. But because of the English interest, it became bigger, and then it also was of bigger interest for the German media. So that was very, very helpful. And it is actually curious that no one had picked up on this, obviously.
Yeah. And it says something about our society's relationship with this phenomenon of drug use. Drugs are something that are peripheral, or something that are a subculture. In the discussion before ours, they were talking about how populist movements and populist leaders make an enemy out of these small minorities. Drug users are one of these minorities. What for me in your book I found really interesting to see, first of all, this mass production and mass intoxication of the German army, and the mass production of Pervitin and methamphetamine on one hand, which is really impressive and you describe it very, very well. But also this portrait of Hitler, basically I remember this scene where he has to meet Mussolini, and he's a mess. He cannot get up. He doesn't have energy. He's basically unable to do an international meeting. It's a very important moment in the war. They are losing the war. They are afraid that Italy might get out of the war, and so then the doctor comes in and he injects Hitler with his magic serum, and up he goes, and he speaks continuously for 4 hours straight. So this contrast between this public image full of life, full of energy, full of decisions, and the reality behind of somebody who is really very ill and listless and unable to control themselves. It made some connections with people like Michael Jackson, for example, and another public figure where now we know that he was taking a lot of drugs and sleeping with basically intensive care unit substances.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to read Morell's papers because Hitler obviously is a propaganda product.
Yeah.
So to be in the archive and have the original handwritings of his doctor, who like in a way tells the story as it was, or like tells a lot about the story as it was, like what actually happened in Hitler's office when he was just with Hitler and discussing, like it is an inside view that is quite rare. So that was one of the fascinating aspects of this research. I felt at times like I was like the fly on the wall who could, through the papers of Morell, kind of look at what was going on, which kind of demasks the propaganda around Hitler, because one of the key elements of the cult around the so-called Führer was to create a picture of this person who almost has no private life and who has, of course, is not drug addicted. I mean, even the opposite was proclaimed of Hitler. He was in a way the first statesman who was an anti-drug. He was rallying against drugs. Like the Nazi Party was the first party who was, when they took office in 1933, created an anti-drug propaganda. I mean, there was in America about at the same time, anti-drug policies became more and more influential, but in Europe it was really Germany at the forefront with the Nazi Party trying to eradicate the excessive, apparently, freedom during the during the Weimar Republic, where there were drug laws in effect in Germany between 1918 and 1933, but they were not really enforced. So drugs were part of the culture, especially in Berlin, and all this changed when the Nazis came to power in 1933. Like one of their populist enemies was this chaos of the Weimar Republic, and this chaos was closely connected to drug use. And drugs were used also because people needed them. After the First World War, a lot of people were addicted to morphine or using morphine because they had been wounded or had been traumatized. So,
but also it was the first time these substances were available to the great public in a very consistent manner. This is something that I found really interesting, and I admit I didn't know that the American very tough anti-drug stance of the 50s and then all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s was actually linked and inspired by the Nazi anti-drug policies from the 30s.
Well, this is what I explore in the kind of follow-up book, which is not in Romanian yet, but it's out in Germany as Der stärkste Stoff, and in France and Italy it's already out, and coming out in the UK and the US as Tripped in April. It starts with the American narcotics agent Giuliani, who came to Berlin in 1945 to bombed out, destroyed Berlin in the summer of 1945. He was the narcotics agent. His job was to regulate the chaotic drug situation in post-war Berlin, because after the Nazis left, there was still a lot of drugs that the Wehrmacht had kept, and Berlin was again suddenly a drug city, and the American officer's job, his boss was Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a very influential person in not only the United States but for drug policies worldwide. He sent his man Giuliani to Berlin with the intent that Giuliani would develop an anti-drug policy that covers the 4 sectors, because Germany was occupied by 4 powers. All the 4 sectors should be united in their fight against drugs, and then because Anslinger was also the drug, he was very active in the United Nations and pushing a global anti-drug policy, and kind of pointing at Berlin, where for the first time everyone was uniting to create this anti-drug policy, and this Giuliani was completely overwhelmed with handling this task. And at one point he was contacted, and I described this in this book, Tripped. He was contacted by a former Gestapo drug policeman, and he said, come on, I basically know how to do it. We had all these things in place, and why don't you just take what we did and implement it in an American style? And Anslinger had no problems. Anslinger from Washington had no problems accepting this, so he had no Berührungsängste, like he was not anxious to kind of implement Nazis' anti-drug policies, turn them into US policies. So the war on drugs, this term comes much later, comes in the 70s, but it was basically already constructed and thought about much earlier, has a lot of Nazi influences.
So it looks like this process of no laws following by moving into the opposite direction of very tough laws is something that has, for example, in Romania, we are at the moment in a very harsh period of increasing punishments, prison punishments for drug users and for drug dealers. Basically, I think at the moment the highest prison sentence you can get is for drug dealing, even more than for a murder or for rape. We have the current political parties going on television about how they want to be tough on drugs. We have minimum sentencing, which is something we have seen in the States, and that contributed to them becoming the #1 country with the most imprisoned people as percentage of their population. We have also mandatory sentencing to prison. And this happens without any kind of pushback from the civil society. Basically, for example, we had some similar anti-gay attempts at legislation a few years ago, and there was a strong pushback against this from the civil society. But it looks like the artists, the NGOs, the culture environment has no problem with putting drug users in prison, and there was almost no response to this. How do you see this
I see this highly
phenomenon?
problematic. It seems like drugs have no lobby,
Drug users.
Drug users have no lobby.
Yeah.
It's very easy. They're very easy targets. Who wants to be, no politician wants to be pro-drugs, even though the reality is that everyone uses drugs, or at least so many people use it, actually. But it's still a stigmatized topic. People are maybe ashamed of it or think that there's something wrong. So I think what we do need is a European discourse or a public discourse.
Yeah.
But what drugs actually are, and it is opening up in the world right now. I mean, we have the so-called psychedelic renaissance. since the laws have softened a little bit in some parts of the world, universities immediately start researching, and as soon as they start researching substances like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA, they find that they're actually not dangerous. I mean, every drug, if it's sugar or nicotine or alcohol or LSD or cannabis, of course there can be dangers involved, but if you look at it from a medicinal or scientific point of view, psychedelic drugs, for example, have much more benefits than they have dangers. So it's just a matter of educating people or finding ways on how to incorporate them or into therapy or into society, basically. So we have a lot of Nachholbedarf, we have a lot of catching up to do, which is because the America illegalized these substances in the 70s. Nixon, it was U.S. President Nixon who declared the war on drugs. I mean, there were already a lot of substances illegal before, but he also made then the psychedelic substances illegal. I guess that's why I wrote the second book on the history of psychedelic drugs, because I think first we need to know like where they came from and why they became illegal and actually what they could do. And in my case, it was interesting also because it turned into a personal experiment.
Yeah, I wanted you to ask, you talk about giving your mother who is suffering or who was suffering from Alzheimer's.
Still is, yeah.
Giving her microdoses of LSD.
Yeah.
And I really love that description of that gray day walk. Can you tell more? Can you tell more about how this experiment has been evolving?
Well,
because Alzheimer's is not a usual diagnosis connected with the psychedelic treatments.
Well, I have found a study by an American startup company who is trying to develop psychedelics into medicines called Eleusis. They had done clinical trials with microdoses of LSD and trying to, see how it could affect the people who suffer from Alzheimer. And they came to, their first findings was that their findings were very quite surprising, actually, because they found that LSD works on the very same receptors that Alzheimer destroys. It's the 5-HT2TA. I might get it wrong, but it's a specific receptor in the brain. It kind of dies from Alzheimer, and LSD actually stimulates it. So that was a starting point, and then I, talked to researchers who had done some research. There's one professor, for example, in Switzerland, where the laws are a little bit softer, because Switzerland, because of its unique neutral status, does not ratify all of the anti-drug laws, or is a little bit different. So there's Professor Franz Vollenweider from the university in Zurich, and he's been looking at doing brain scans since the early 90s of patients under LSD or psilocybin, then looks exactly what's actually happening in the brain. And he also comes to the same conclusion. So I discussed this with my father and my mother, who already was, that Alzheimer's is a terrible, disease, and especially my father, taking care of my mother, being very frustrated by what the conventional medicine has, like the pharmaceutical industry has to offer, was, even though he'd been a judge in his life and actually put people in prison for drug abuse or use or drug crime, was quite open. But he said, if scientists come to the conclusion that LSD might help, I actually don't understand why it's not a medicine. Like, what actually happened to LSD? Why did it ever get onto this, why did it ever have a different history?
You should read this book, Father.
Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
So that's when I started the research to actually. I became very interested in the company who developed LSD, which was Sandoz, which now is Novartis, one of the biggest pharmaceutical giants in the world, based in Basel, Switzerland. So I went to their archive. And everyone who's a little interested in LSD knows the story of Albert Hofmann, who actually discovered LSD in 1943. And he was a big fan of LSD, like of his own discovery. He always thought that this would be the game-changing medicine against mental diseases. He thought it was actually a very healing substance. So I was curious in the question. I tried to figure out the answer to why Sandoz, who was also a very powerful company, was not able to market it. And I think I found the answer in this book, Tripped. But it's a complex story.
Yeah. So at the moment, what do you think about the LSD and Alzheimer's?
Well, all the scientists that look into this I've spoken to, did research on for the new book, think that this is, the way to go. Not only Alzheimer. Alzheimer is only a form of dementia. Dementia in general seems to be caused by neuroinflammation of the brain. And it's scientifically proven that LSD reduces the neuroinflammation. So I think it's really a shame that we have not properly researched LSD since the 50s, since it was, we were able to research it. Because not probably, but maybe my mother would never have developed Alzheimer if, there had been a medicine. And now it will take another 10, 20, maybe 30 years. It depends how quick politicians change the laws until, more research can be done. But one thing is for sure, dementia is one of the biggest problems of humanity. It's rising. I think in 2050 there will be, I forgot how many, like a lot of people will suffer from dementia, hundreds of millions worldwide. And this has devastating effects on communities and mental health systems. And the reason why we don't have medicines, one of the reasons is this ridiculous prohibition of psychedelic substances, which was motivated politically. It's not motivated scientifically. Like, politicians didn't find out in the 50s, these substances are dangerous, we have to prohibit them. This was done for political reasons and this racist reasons, ideological reasons. For example, for Nixon, it was the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. The peace movement in America was heavily using LSD. That was his knee-jerk reaction to prohibit LSD and therefore criminalize the anti-war movement, being able to target people and put them in prison. And we're still suffering from that. My mother might be suffering from that. We might be suffering from that in 20, 30 years when like a third of us in the room might develop dementia. So I think this is a very serious topic that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be education about it.
And actually the whole psychedelic movement started with the reassessment of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, because they thought it would be better accepted than LSD, who was carrying such a heavy stigma with it.
Yeah, I examined this in the new book, and the reason actually why LSD is so stigmatized, again, has a Nazi past, because the CEO of Sandoz, Arthur Stoll, the boss of Albert Hoffmann, who discovered LSD. Arthur Stoll was best friends with Richard Kuhn, and Richard Kuhn was the leading biochemist of the so-called Third Reich, and Kuhn's job was to find for the Nazis a truth serum, because the paranoid system of National Socialism wanted to find something like, and also they were very open to scientific, findings. So they wanted to find a drug that you could give to someone that you interrogate, and that someone would tell you all his secrets. Like you could basically read someone's mind if you had the truth serum. And the Nazis thought maybe, and Stoll communicated with Kuhn in 1943, we have now found this most potent agent, LSD, because LSD is more potent than any other drug that exists. It already works in microgram dosages very, very strongly in the mind. So Kuhn's fantasy was, we can somehow turn LSD into a weapon. And the Nazis then designed a series of tests in the concentration camp of Dachau, where they gave inmates mescaline, which is another psychedelic substance, and LSD, trying to figure out whether they could use it as a weapon. And they failed. It didn't work out, but they worked on it. And before they actually concluded that they failed, like they didn't succeed, and then they lost the war. And the American forces had a special unit called ALSOS, and ALSOS was a unit of intelligence agents that were kind of invading Germany with the military, and their job was to capture German scientists who were working on the German nuclear program, because the Americans thought that the Germans were very advanced in developing a nuclear weapon. But ALSOS also had a second job, and that was to find new biochemical weapons. And one of the first scientists they interviewed was in the spring of 1945, was Richard Kuhn in Heidelberg, and he basically spilled the beans, and he talked about the psychedelic research that the Nazis did, and then the Americans became very interested in LSD, and created a program called MK Ultra, where the newly founded CIA was examining LSD on a broad scale, like can you manipulate someone? Can you destroy someone through LSD? Can you use it as a weapon? Could you, for example, poison a whole Soviets, like Moscow, by putting LSD into the water reserve and stuff like that? Or could you just disable a Russian a ship, like a military ship, if you were able to dose the whole crew? And so the Americans became extremely interested in LSD because the Nazis were so interested in LSD, because Stoll basically gave all his information to Kuhn. So in a way, it was the Swiss company itself who shot themselves in the knee, because through the Nazis, the American deep state became very interested in trying to figure out whether LSD could be used as a weapon, which was never possible. They never succeeded, but that's why LSD was prevented from becoming a medicine, coming onto the market. There was actually a meeting of the CIA, the MK Ultra head, Gottlieb. He flew to Basel and was in the office of Stoll and wanted to buy the whole the whole stash that Sandoz had produced until then, and kind of made Sandoz promise that they would never sell it to the Eastern Bloc, and that it would not put it on the market even in the West, that the CIA and America would have control over it, and therefore Sandoz would still be able to operate and sell all its other products in America. So Sandoz was under pressure from the American establishment, or secret establishment, but I think they still could have, stood their ground as neutral Swiss, pharmaceutical company. But maybe that's a naive assessment in a capitalist environment where, America is the dominating force and, can determine quite a lot of what's going on.
But I think you were talking about the treatment side about Alzheimer's. Also, there are opinions that say that LSD is actually the most effective, according to the research before it's becoming illegal. It's the most effective medication for alcoholism. Also, at the moment, psilocybin is being approved actually in some places for treatment of depression. So you talk about the treatment, but I think this other area which Hoffman was very fond of increasing this feeling of being one with the nature and with the environment. So actually creating spiritual beings out of human beings. I think this might, as Hoffman say, might actually be the most important element of all, because we are dealing at the moment with huge crises, with humanitarian crisis, a climatic crisis. So maybe we are a little bit like Berlin after losing World War I, and people really needing.
I'm absolutely convinced about this, and Hoffman was also convinced. I found a memo in the archive of Novartis where he kind of sketches on how he thinks that the pharmaceutical company Sandoz should develop, and this was a memo to Stoll, the CEO, where he says we already developed LSD, and he had isolated the psilocybin from the so-called magic mushrooms that were found in Mexico. So he knew already a lot about psychedelics. So he said Sandoz should use this Vorsprung, this advantage that they had compared to other pharmaceutical companies, to really become a psychedelic pharmaceutical company and really develop psychedelic medicines that could then treat mental problems that became more and more prominent after the end of the Second World War, with so much trauma, and also with modern society accelerating at the pace it did in the 50s, which leads to alienation of people. And so he thought that actually he always believed that there's a spiritual component to these psychedelic substances, which connects people with the whole. Like, people get more and more isolated in the modern era, and psychedelics kind of work the other way. And the way they do work the other way, which only was found out by Vollenweider, the professor I talked about before, in the 90s, and I think this is quite interesting, how does it actually work in the brain? And it works in the brain. That's why I also personally think that LSD is very healthy, because how it works in the brain is that it slightly decreases the blood flow to what brain scientists call the default mode network. And the default mode network in the brain, Freud would call it the ego, is basically the boss in the brain, who right now is also active in me and in all of us, says, we have the literary festival right now, and I'm sitting here and you're here and you're the audience, and we're talking about my books and LSD. This is the default mode network kind of is essential also for us humans, because it gives us security and kind of enables us to understand like us. But on psychedelics, the blood flow to the center is decreased, and therefore other parts of the brain, who are usually kind of shutting up because the boss is talking, have the ability and actually do exercise this ability and become more active
and more interconnected.
Yeah, and what they actually do is they connect. So peripheral parts of the brain start connecting, which creates new. And actually, first of all, it decreases this notion of, oh, there's another person that is separated from me, which is what the default mode network does. So on LSD, it's more like this is decreased, so there's more a feeling of oneness.
Yeah.
Like I describe this in the book. when we walk past a tree, and usually you're like, this is a tree, maybe you even know what type of tree it is an oak tree, and it's kind of, it does certain things in the environment, like, but it's the separate thing. But once this is decreased, you kind of more experience this majestic being that, like, you don't judge it, and you don't judge it as much as before. So that enhances the feeling of oneness. And if you take a large doses of LSD, that effect is very much enhanced to states of consciousness where you really become one with everything. And these are quasi-religious or very spiritual, not religious, but very spiritual experiences. And Hoffman, who took large doses, had these experiences, and this is some of the benefits of LSD, is to experience such states, even in small dosages or in large dosages.
Yeah. And it really is a substance for all people, because you need older people, because you need to have your bag of experiences, and you already need to have some sort of life experience, so that this substance can actually it's like one of those kaleidoscopes that it just moves around. So you need some experiences that the LSD then can interconnect. And I think there's a real danger, because I see a lot of resurgence of psychedelic use among young people. And for them, it can be really dangerous, because it can trigger psychotic episodes and even schizophrenia. And even if it doesn't, they don't have the life experience, the baggage of experience that the LSD then can mold into a spiritual experience or into a oneness experience. It just creates a lot of confusion, and I think LSD should really come with a warning that the older you are, the better experience you can have on this
I
drug.
think you're right. Yeah. I mean, that's what also would be interesting to properly do research on, like what age as a society would we recommend people to use psychedelics. I certainly, I have a 15-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son, and I certainly wouldn't recommend them to take LSD. It's absurd, but it's also not necessary, because young people, the brain is still very plastic. It's called plasticity, neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
And in babies, neuroplasticity is the highest. Like it's like forming like all the time. And also with children, it's still very active. And then there's a certain point in life. I don't know when that point comes. We would probably have to, Vollenweider would probably also know a lot about that. When neuroplasticity slows down and the brain becomes more and more rigid,
Exactly.
And then I think it's extremely beneficial.
Yeah.
To again increase neuroplasticity.
Yeah,
because in a way the brain always tries to find the perfect, shape in dealing with the situation it is in. Like the brain is always neuroplastic, basically. Maybe except when you have Alzheimer, it really that's like the opposite of.
Or when you have addiction, or when you have really treatment-resistant depression, or
then
when
it's
you have OCD. Then
those are not plastic.
Yeah, it becomes.
That's why it's already clinically proven that psilocybin is effective against depression that cannot be treated otherwise.
Yeah.
Because that's, the effect is that you always, think about the same things, so you kind of ruminate.
Yeah.
And the psilocybin triggers you to have, because, default mode network, or the network that, always goes in the same circles is, slightly deactivated. So that's how it works, actually.
Yeah. So, actually, in the studies for depression, the effects of the antidepressant effect of psilocybin also correlates with the spiritual experience. So the more intense the spiritual experience people have, the more effective the antidepressant effect is as well. So there's a correlation between these two, between the spiritual effect of the substance and the antidepressant or whatever.
Yeah, that's why, like, psychiatrists who know about this also would recommend, like I heard it quite often, to take larger dosages.
Yeah.
Like microdosing is the big fashion right now. Like everyone does a little bit of microdosing. But if you do like once a year a large dosage, this might be more helpful to you than, because then you have the spiritual experience and you have a much more profound learning experience.
And you prevent the encroachment of just one way of thinking or just...
But I could like, that's why I got interested actually in LSD, because I took it for the first time when I was 24, I think. And I was already, like, I thought my brain's totally rigid. Like I didn't know any word, like it was kind of intuitive that I took it, and it was like an explosion. Like suddenly, like all the walls and all the structures, like how I was about to become a journalist and write like journalistic pieces, and that all kind of evaporated in this very strong trip that I had in New York. Accidentally, basically, my girlfriend at the time gave it to me. I had no idea what this was, and it all like was gone, and I was really free in thinking and reinventing myself. So it was a very creative experience actually, and I can only wish that people have this experience.
So we're maybe here at this table because of that experience.
For sure. Without that experience, I would be editor of Spiegel magazine in Hamburg, and I would be depressed, and I would cheat on my wife, and I would drink a lot of alcohol. I'm pretty sure about that.
So thank you very much for this discussion. Before opening maybe for some questions, I was wondering if because it really looks like you really, there are very few people. One of them, there's also a journalist in the States, Michael Pollan, who wrote you probably know it, a book on the history of treatment with psychedelics. And there are not many people who have the courage of writing about this subject that everybody seems to avoid. Are you planning anything in this direction, or?
I have another book project, but I don't want to reveal it yet because it's still brewing inside of me. But I also like to write about non-drug related issues. But you're right, this book about LSD, even more than this book about Nazis and drugs, which was very interesting to me, but the book about LSD was much more personal and rewarding for myself, for my family, for my mother, for my father. And I'm getting now also emails from people, that have problems or, become interested in it. So I'm very happy about it, but right now at the moment, I don't know what my next book will be about, so maybe I'll have to take another LSD trip and hope for the best. Because also sometimes you take it and you don't have great new ideas.
Yeah.
But maybe you could also take it and see I took one time a trip and I had a whole book, like in the span of 6 to 8 hours, I saw a whole book in front of me, and this will actually come out in September in German. And it has nothing to do with drugs, but I saw the book while I was on LSD, and I might not have seen it otherwise, actually. I don't know, maybe I would also sit here if I would never have taken LSD. It's not quite clear, but for me, it has been rewarding to take psychedelics, and rewarding and fun to write about psychedelics. And maybe I'll write a novel now about. Because a lot of things during the research I couldn't put in the book, so who knows what I will do next.
Well, but we have a new page in this world of drugs that is unfolding at the moment with the
Yeah,
with
it
the
is quite-
new
it is quite
psychoactive
interesting.
substances that are being constantly manufactured
Yeah.
and thrown on the market, the fentanyl crisis. So basically, what Hoffman did, what was it, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, it's actually happening at a massive speed with hundreds. Literally, the moment there are, I think, about 1,000 new drugs being monitored in the European Union that just came after 2010. So it's, I think it's a shift in paradigm that's really amazing.
I think it's our only hope against populism and the growth of stupidity in the world and violence, because these substances certainly encourage a completely different behavior. So I would really hope that more and more people get interested in it. And
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. So, do we have any questions for Mr. Ohler?
Well, it's a wide field, those drugs, and as we are here because of a war in Ukraine, I would like to come back to this subject. That is also the subject of the book before, the LSD book, where Hitler and others were also influenced by drugs, and also the Wehrmacht and the soldiers. And I just would like to ask whether you and then we heard, for example, that in Israel the Hamas had obviously also taken drugs when they were going from Gaza to the area of the south, where they intruded in the kibbutzim and other places. And also I asked myself whether also in Russia or in Ukraine drugs are being taken. I don't know whether it's a stupid question, but I just ask myself this other side of the drugs, whether how much you have done research on it, also in the actual situation.
well, I found it interesting, for example, that on the day Putin invaded the Ukraine, well, the whole of the Ukraine, I mean, he did invade before already, he made a statement that the Ukrainian government or regime was full of drug addicts, Nazis and drug addicts. So I actually thought, did he read my book? Because it's also published in Russian. And now again and again you read reports that the Ukrainian army, that they use speed. Speed is the perfect fighting drug. The Nazis invented it, but many armies copied it. The Americans copied it, the English army copied it. So I also, and you read that the Russian army takes amphetamines. I wouldn't be surprised if both sides actually take it, because it does reduce your fear and it does give you extra energy for a certain period of time when you have to go into battle. And I also read a report, a complaint actually by the Hamas, what is Zoll in English? Customs. That was from May 2023, that Israel was deliberately pushing Captagon. Captagon is an amphetamine drug which is kind of similar to methamphetamine. It's a very strong amphetamine that is very popular in the Arab world and is fueling the Assad regime. Like the Assad regime controls the Captagon production in the Arab world. And I actually heard, I don't know if that's true, that the last European country where Captagon was produced was Romania. And then it became illegal in Europe. When Romania joined the EU, it also couldn't make Captagon anymore. And then the Captagon is now really produced in Syria. And Captagon is a very big market. And the Hamas customs said that Israel is pushing Captagon into the Gaza Strip to destabilize or to corrupt the youth of Gaza, and then they confiscated in May 2023 I don't know. You can actually look it up. Just Google. It's quite easy to Google. Like 2 million tablets of Captagon, something like this. And obviously, this Captagon. Obviously, there was Captagon in Gaza, whether it was pushed by Israel or whether it was supplied by Iran or maybe by both sides, or like there was a lot of, and probably still is a lot of Captagon in the Gaza Strip. And I was interviewed by a Haaretz newspaper, the Israeli newspaper, about this attack on October 7th. And I don't have, it's hard to prove actually. I don't know if they found Captagon, or I think they're, like Haaretz made a really big article about it. So it seems like that the Hamas fighters who attacked Israel on that day were using quite a bit of Captagon, which then, creates this horrific scenario at this rave where over 400 people, I think, were killed, and they were mostly on psychedelics, like this Israeli psychedelic rave. So the attackers were on speed, the Nazi drug, while the party goers were on psychedelics, which completely opens you up and makes you extremely sensitive. So it's, being in a terrorist attack sober is horrific, but being in a terrorist attack while you are, for example, on LSD, where you just experience everything like 100 times as intense. Like now in Israel, they're trying to treat these people because it's never happened before. A lot of people on psychedelics were exposed to horrific atrocities. So yeah, this October 7th certainly has a drug angle to it, and makes it even more sad, obviously. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. Looking forward to read the book. And I would like to ask you, I'm there with you in the idea of regularizing, making available, and for the public the psychedelic substances. But in your opinion, what would it take from a, let's say, cultural perspective to do just that? I mean, the amount of alcohol on the on the market is, great and uncontrolled, but and it makes more damage. You know how the joke goes: if 4 guys drink beer, they will end up fighting. If 4 guys smoke a joint, they will end up making a rock band. So,
well, I mean, the first thing is that we need a discourse in a society. People need to know what the different drugs actually are. That's also part of why I've written this new book on psychedelics, to inform a little bit of where they come from and what they are. And Michael Pollan's book is informative, and I think we need a discourse in society about these substances before we legalize them, because they're very potent substances. And also me, quite experienced user, if I take a high dosage of LSD, it's also for me, it's extremely strong. So I wouldn't want, it's not good if people take, this maybe at a too early age, too high a dosage, don't know that they should be in a nice environment. Maybe they take it in a in a stressful environment. So we actually need to understand more about them. The media should be more open about them. The media in Germany especially is very conservative about drugs. Also, for example, the Spiegel that I mentioned before, there's still a lot of prejudices against drugs, or people who don't. Like someone once said, maybe it was Timothy Leary, I'm not sure, like the drugs are actually dangerous for those people who don't take them, because they have all these fears about them, and but people who actually have been lucky enough to make experiences with psychedelics or with cannabis, I mean, it's banal, but usually don't have problems, but actually enjoy them. And but there is still a danger that people who don't know anything about them suddenly take a big dose of LSD and cannot handle it. So we have to, that's what I would work on if I was the Secretary of Health. I would try to educate people, because people are taking these substances, like hundreds of thousands of people are taking them and basically don't know what they are taking, because they actually don't know what they're taking. I also usually don't know what I'm taking because it's from some illegal source. It's not like I cannot buy, and you cannot buy a Novartis package where it says each pill contains 100 micrograms of pure LSD, then you would know exactly what you have. And so it's kind of reckless, I think, by our governments to prohibit drugs, knowing that people still take drugs. So this really must change.
But if I may add to this, I would start with the word drug itself and what we understand by because at the moment what we understand by drugs is the illegal what's the Americans have made illegal, and we don't consider, for example, benzodiazepines, antidepressants, or antipsychotics as drugs, although they can be sold and bought on the black market as drugs as well. So when we enlarge the meaning of the word drug as being any substance that will have an effect on the body and the mind, and especially the mind, then we can understand there's a lot of drug taking in the world. We are taking huge amounts of antidepressants and benzodiazepines and sleeping pills, and all sorts of other pills that can be all considered drugs. And funny enough, in Romania, because of this very anti-drug stance that the politicians and the police have taken, at the moment we have this regulation where if you are being caught driving under the influence of drugs, you can get a sentence. And by drugs, they understand antidepressants, sleeping pills, ADHD medication, methadone. So basically, almost any preparations that the psychiatrist prescribes. So in a way, we are very progressive. We call everything a drug only because we wanted to forbid everything. So at the moment, if your doctor prescribes, I don't know, a sleeping pill, you will, and you're caught in the street driving your car, even with minute amounts of benzodiazepines in your blood, for example, prescribed by your doctor, you will be considered a criminal and have a criminal offense on your record, and actually be sentenced. Even if you don't go to prison, there will be a suspended prison sentence against you just because you have a medically prescribed drug.
There's a lot to be done.
So maybe next you will be coming back to help us push a more progressive agenda.
Yeah, Germany is now legalizing cannabis on April 1st. It's the third country in Europe after Malta and Luxembourg. So it's the first big country to legalize cannabis. It's like a small step, I guess. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and good luck with your next projects.
Well, thank you for leading this discussion. Thank you very much.